Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the progressive movement. And the progressive movement, this was a time when people were really trying to move forward. Progress means to move forward, so that's why they call it the progressive movement. And the causes of the progressive movement were economic exploitation, the formation of trust in monopolies, and exploitation of natural resources. So we talked last class about trust and monopolies. That's where companies get together, or maybe one company completely controls a product, so it can become very expensive. We don't have them today, but it would be like if shoes costed $500 and you couldn't buy them anywhere else. Another big thing was political corruption, and corruption's when politicians taking money for favors. So this would be like me, Mr. Verloop, if I was arrested for maybe stealing from a bunch of stores, but I didn't want to go to jail, so I give money to a politician and I don't have to go to prison. That would be corruption. There was a lot of corruption in politics back then. And one of the things was there was a formation of political machines maintaining power through bribes and voter intimidation. So they kind of scared people not to vote, and there was a lot of bribes. Bribes is the same thing. It's where you're taking money and giving people favors. That would be like one of my students coming up and saying, "Mr. Verloop, I really want an A," but they got an F on the test, but they give me $100, and I go, "Okay, you get an A now." That would be a bribe, which that won't happen. If you give me $100, you won't pass the test. The other one was social injustice, which at this time there was a lot of child labor. Children worked really long days. They can work up to 16 hours. They got paid very little. Living conditions were very bad. You guys remember the tenements and slums? I mean, those were horrible living conditions. There wasn't a lot of bathrooms, a lot of people in one room. It was dirty. There was also that people wanted consumer protection. They wanted racial, gender, and ethnic equality. So during this time, racial, I mean, if you were African American or if you were an immigrant, you weren't going to be treated very well. You weren't going to be equal. Same thing for gender. Women were not treated as well as men. Children and women got paid very little, much less than men. I mean, women wanted the same rights as men. So a lot of people didn't like these things, so they're going to start fighting to try to fix all this stuff. They want progress, they want to go forward, they want a better United States. The goals of the progressive movement were to guarantee economic opportunity, so everybody had the chance to make money. They wanted it to provide political power to the public, which means they wanted more people voting. And they wanted to eliminate social injustices, which means they want men, women, black, Hispanic, white, should all be equal. They just want everyone to be equal. And there's something called muckraking progressive leaders, and what you have to know is muckrakers, those are individuals who attempted to expose corruption and inequality during the progressive era in economics, politics, and society. So if you're a muckraker, it meant maybe you wrote books or you wrote for a magazine, and you tried to show how things were not equal. You were showing how things were not equal. So they were good because lots of times the public didn't know bad things that were going on. And a muckraker, they allowed people to know the bad things going on. And some of the people we're going to talk about are Ida Tarbell. He wrote the history of the Standard Oil Company. The other is Lincoln Steffens, which is the shame of the cities. And Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. And Ida Tarbell did the history of the Standard Oil Company, and this book talked about the ruthless, which means mean, methods used by Standard Oil Company to rise to power and how they formed a monopoly on oil. So Standard Oil Company eventually had a monopoly, which meant if you wanted to get oil in the United States, they were the only company you can buy oil from. There was nobody else. Like today you have Shell, you have Chevron. There's lots of places you can buy oil from, but back then there was only the Standard Oil Company. So they can charge a lot, and people didn't have a choice because you needed oil for almost everything. But this book shows how Standard Oil, how corrupt they were and how they were bad and how they were a monopoly. So it was an important book. Lincoln Steffens wrote The Shame of the Cities, and this showed the corruption that existed in several United States cities. So places like New York or Chicago had a lot of corruption. Police officers took bribes. There was just a lot of negative things that were going on, and he showed how corrupt they were. And the last one is Upton Sinclair, and he wrote a book called The Jungle. And this is a book that showed meat companies sold bad meat. It also shows how bad working conditions were for the workers. So this one was very, very important because people just went to the grocery store and bought meat and nobody ever checked it. But companies were throwing rats in it. There's stories of people's hands getting cut off and they would just throw it in the meat. Nobody washed their hands. Nobody ever cleaned anything. They put chemicals in really old meat so it smelled like it was new even though it wasn't. And a lot of people got sick because the meat was so bad during this time, but nobody had any idea. And Upton Sinclair, he wrote this book called The Jungle, and all of a sudden a lot of people knew that meat was not made the way it was supposed to be. So we're going to talk about the accomplishments now of the progressive movement, and we're going to talk about some of the, it says national legislation. Legislation, all that means is laws. If something's legislation, it means it's a law. So some of the economic ones is the Sherman Antitrust Act, prevented any business structure that restrains trade. So essentially it made monopolies illegal. That's why today if you want to buy a phone, there isn't just one phone. There's lots of companies that make phone. There's Samsung, there's Nexus, there's Apple, there's Windows. I mean, there's lots of phones. Same thing if you want to buy a car. There's Honda, there's Ford, there's Chevy. There's lots of places you can buy. It's not just one company. And that is because the Sherman Antitrust Act does not allow that to happen. There's also the Clayton Antitrust Act, which just expands upon the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this exempting unions from prosecution under the Sherman Act, and it outlawed price fixing. So essentially, the big thing is unions. Sometimes if you're in a union, you would get in trouble. But now you can be in a union, and unions are a good thing. Like there's teachers unions. So we have people that meet, try to figure out how much teachers should get paid. And just if somebody was to do something bad, like Fairfax County is going to pay teachers less, the union would be very upset about it. So it's very important. And the other is price fixing. So that's just where shoe companies would get together and say, you know what, we're going to sell shoes for $10. You can't fix prices. They can be whatever people want. And the Federal Reserve System was established. All right, so here's some more accomplishments. There's some political ones. Primary elections were established. And essentially what this is, if you guys remember in government, the political parties have primaries. So before Donald Trump was elected president, he had to win the Republican primary. And same thing, Hillary Clinton, even though Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, before that election, Hillary Clinton ran against other Democrats in the primary election. And one of the big amendments that was passed was the 17th Amendment. And this established the direct election of United States senators. Before this, state senators weren't necessarily elected by the people, even though it's a very important position. Senators are in office for 6 years, and they're the ones that actually make the laws. Remember, the president does not make laws, the Supreme Court does not make laws. Senators and representatives make laws, and this allowed people to vote for senators. Before that, they didn't vote for senators. So 17th Amendment allows people to vote for senators. Next, we're going to talk about some more amendments. The 18th Amendment was called Prohibition. It made alcohol illegal. I know you guys are thinking, but there's alcohol today. But during this time, they made alcohol illegal with the 18th Amendment. And there was the 19th Amendment, which was women's suffrage. And remember, suffrage means to vote. And the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And efforts to gain the right to vote for women were realized through the strong leadership of the women's movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, as well as the nation's recognition of women's wartime contributions during World War I. So World War I we'll get into more later, but while men were fighting in World War I, lots of women started working in factories, and they realized, you know what, we do a good job, so they ended up getting the right to vote. And later on, some other legislation. One was called Consumer Protection, and this enacted the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So now there's people who inspect meat before it goes into restaurants or goes into stores. So now when you go and buy, if you're going to buy beef, you're going to buy chicken, carnitas, whatever you're buying, it's been, it's safe. The government's inspected it. And there's also the Pure Food and Drug Act, and that just goes to other food. So just like if you're eating Takis, the government's inspected that. They know it's safe for you to eat. And same thing with drugs. When we say drugs, we're not talking about marijuana, things like that, but we're talking about like Advil, aspirin, drugs that make you feel better when you're sick. The government inspects those. And last, the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition, so it made alcohol legal again. That's why today, if you're 21, you're allowed to drink alcohol. But before the 21st Amendment, back when it was the 18th Amendment, so the 18th Amendment made it illegal, and then if you go farther in the future, 21st Amendment, all of a sudden you could drink alcohol again. But there was a brief period of time in the United States where you would go to jail if you had alcohol. And the last few things, there's something called an initiative, and that's a law that begins with the people. It used to be only senators and representatives would make laws, or they had to propose laws, but now people. I mean, if you want to make a law, you can get signatures and you can have it sent to Congress to vote on it. There's a referendum, which is a change to a law, so you can change laws now. And there's something called a recall, which is important. This is a special election to remove a politician from office. So let's say the governor of Virginia isn't doing a good job and nobody likes him. You can actually get enough signatures and you can have an election. And if people vote to get rid of them, you can get rid of them. And this last one's important. This is a secret ballot. And this is when you vote and nobody is allowed to know who you voted for. Before this, sometimes people would stand over you. Sometimes everybody saw the piece of paper that you had. And this was bad because sometimes you'd be pressured. If people knew you voted for someone, you could get beat up. You can lose your job if you voted for a certain way. But now the ballots are secret. You go into a booth, nobody sees who you voted for. You drop your paper off somewhere, nobody sees what it is, and they count it later. So ballots are secret now when you vote, which is good because it's much safer. All right, next week is going to be the test, so make sure you're studying and ready for this. And if you have any questions, let me know.